In 18th century Italy, an estimated 4,000 boys per year were castrated so they could keep their high singing voices into adulthood. 4,000 per year in one country for about 100 years straight. That's the opening fact. I'm not building to it. It's just the number. And the official paperwork, the actual document filed with the local parish, listed the procedure as treatment for a hernia. A hernia the boy did not have. A hernia that, statistically, was happening to roughly 4,000 Italian boys per year, all of whom, coincidentally, also had above-average singing voices, all of whom, coincidentally, were treated by surgeons who did not perform any other type of surgery. By signing, both parties agreed to the terms. Nobody read them. Everybody honored them. Hi, I'm Elliot. This is the incident report. I'm a forensic accountant of bad ideas, which is a job title I gave myself and which has so far gotten me 0 job offers and 1 weird email from a guy in Ohio. We're going to talk about castrati today. We, meaning you and me, two normal people on the internet, are going to look at a documented economic pipeline that ran for almost 300 years in a major European country, and at no point did anyone with the authority to stop it actually stop it. And I want to be clear up front. Real people made these decisions on purpose with contracts. Let's open the file. So here's how it worked. A family in southern Italy, usually poor, usually rural, usually with more sons than they could feed, would identify a boy somewhere between 7 and 9 years old who had what they considered a promising voice. The local choir master or a scout from a bigger church or sometimes a representative from a music conservatory in Naples or Rome would come listen to the kid sing in the village. If the verdict was favorable, a contract would be drawn up between the family and an institution. The institution paid the family an advance. In exchange, the family agreed to deliver the boy post-procedure to begin training. The procedure was performed by a barber surgeon, often in the back room of a barber shop, sometimes in a private home, occasionally, and this is documented, in a bathhouse because the warm water was thought to relax the patient. The boy was given opium or held underwater until he passed out. There was no anesthesia in the modern sense. Mortality rates from the surgery itself are estimated by various music historians at somewhere between 10 and 80%. The range is that wide because nobody kept honest records, because officially the surgery wasn't happening. The boys who survived were sent to a conservatory. They lived there. They trained on average for 8 to 10 years. Voice lessons, music theory, Latin, posture, stage presence. It was structurally a boarding school, with one extremely specific admissions requirement. Anyway, of the kids who came out the other side of all that training, and again, 4,000 a year were going in, roughly 99% of them ended up as anonymous members of church choirs. They sang in the Sistine Chapel. They sang in cathedrals across Italy, Austria, Germany, Spain. They got paid a modest salary by the church. They lived in dormitories. They sang the same liturgical music every week for 40 years and then they died, and nobody remembered their names. Yeah, so that happened. This is the part of the story that doesn't usually get told, because it's the part where there's no payoff. There's no movie about the castrato who sang second tenor at a regional cathedral in Bologna for 36 years and then quietly retired to a room above a tavern. Nobody is making that biopic, but statistically, that guy is the story. The famous ones are the asterisk. And the church's role in this is... Okay, so I want to be careful here, because this is the part where the documentation gets genuinely strange. The Catholic Church, as an institution, officially condemned castration. There were papal statements. There were canon law prohibitions against deliberately mutilating the human body. The official position, on paper, in writing was, "This is wrong. Do not do this. Anyone who does this is committing a sin." The Catholic Church also employed castrati in the Sistine Chapel choir continuously from roughly 1599 to 1903. 304 years. 2 stars. Would not recommend. Management, aware of the issue, declined to address it, citing acoustic preferences. So how do you square that? The trick, and I use the word trick generously, was that the church didn't ask. When a castrato showed up to audition, nobody on the church side inquired about how he had become a castrato. The official assumption, written into the hiring records, was that the singer had suffered an unfortunate accident in childhood. A fall, a wild boar attack, a mysterious illness. The records from this period contain a genuinely impressive number of childhood wild boar attacks, all of which targeted the testicles specifically, none of which left any other injuries. The families, when asked, also reported wild boar attacks. The surgeons reported nothing because the surgeons were not asked. The boys, by the time they were old enough to be asked, had been told for 10 years that this was what had happened to them. And what were they going to do? Sue? Nobody was prosecuted. Not once. In 3 centuries. I want to sit with that for a second. Because the legal framework existed. Italian states had laws against this. The church had laws against this. There were technically people whose job it was to enforce these laws. And the entire system simply agreed, in a sustained collective shrug, to not look at the thing that was happening in plain sight, in every village, every year, 4,000 times a year, for 100 years. This is your reminder that sometimes the most powerful institution in the world is the institution of, we are all going to pretend we don't see this. Protect your peace. Avert your eyes. Let the choir sing. Okay, moving on to the 1%, because here's the other half of the pipeline. The very small number of kids who came out of the conservatory with not just a usable voice, but an extraordinary one. Those kids became opera stars. And when I say opera stars, I want you to disconnect that phrase from anything you currently associate with opera, which is probably a guy in a tuxedo, an old woman with binoculars, and tickets that cost more than your rent. In the 17th and 18th centuries, opera was pop music. It was the dominant entertainment medium in most of Europe. The biggest opera singers were the biggest celebrities of their era. And almost all of them, on the male side, were castrati. These guys had screaming fans. Women fainted. Men got into fist fights over which castrato was better. There are documented cases of audience members throwing themselves at the stage, sending love letters, attempting to break into dressing rooms. The word diva comes from this period. The behavior we now associate with rock stars and boy bands and TikTok famous 22-year-olds, the mob crowds, the merchandise, the parasocial obsession, the template was set by Italian men with surgically preserved soprano voices in the 1730s. Same energy, different century. The pay was okay. The pay. A top-tier castrato in the 1740s could earn the modern equivalent of $1 to $2 million per year. They were the highest-paid musicians in Europe. They were, in many cases, the highest-paid entertainers of any kind in Europe. They had estates, they had jewelry collections, they had private carriages. One of them, a guy named Caffarelli, bought a literal duchy with his concert earnings. He became the Duke of San Donato because he sang well. The most famous of all of them was Carlo Broschi, who performed under the stage name Farinelli. Born 1705 in southern Italy, died 1782, rich, spoke multiple languages, friends with kings, probably the highest paid singer in the world for a sustained period of about 20 years. In 1737, he was at the height of his career. He could have signed with any opera house in Europe and named his price. Instead, he got an offer from Queen Elizabeth Farnese of Spain. The offer was this: move to Madrid, sing for the king, privately, every night. The King of Spain at the time was Philip. Philip V had what historians now describe as severe clinical depression, and what people at the time described as melancholy, and what people in his actual household described as the king will not get out of bed, will not bathe, will not change his clothes, and has not spoken to anyone in 3 weeks. This had been going on intermittently for years. The queen had tried doctors. She had tried priests. She had tried, by all accounts, everything. And then somebody, and we don't know who, which is its own tragedy, suggested that maybe the king would respond to music. So the Queen of Spain hired the most famous singer in Europe. She paid him a salary that, by various accounts, exceeded what the king's actual ministers were earning. And his job was to sing 4 songs. The same 4 songs. To the king. Every night. For 10 years. Okay. I want you to understand. Farinelli, who was a once-in-a-generation musical talent, who could have been performing at La Scala, who could have been touring the courts of Europe, took a job in which he sang the same 4 arias to one depressed monarch every single night in a private chamber for nearly a decade. The same songs, on loop, like a Spotify playlist of one with a king attached. This is the most prestigious music gig in the entire 18th century, and it is structurally identical to being the guy who plays acoustic covers at a wine bar in Brooklyn. Except the wine bar is a palace, and the wine bar's only customer is the King of Spain, and he is crying. History is wild. And the songs worked, by the way. That's the thing. The king got out of bed. The king bathed. The king ran the country, badly, for another decade, in part because every night this Italian guy showed up and sang 4 specific arias at him until he felt. When Philip V died in 1746, his son Ferdinand VI took the throne and immediately rehired Farinelli on the same contract, because Ferdinand also had depression, and apparently the family had figured out what worked. Farinelli stayed at the Spanish court for 22 years total. He left in 1759 with a knighthood, a fortune, and what I have to assume was a deeply complicated relationship with the four songs in question. He retired to a villa near Bologna and lived another 23 years. He never performed publicly again. Anyway, so the system kept running, from the mid-1500s straight through the 1800s. The conservatories trained the boys. The church hired the survivors. The opera houses signed the standouts. The families collected the advance, signed the contract, filed the paperwork claiming a hernia, and told the neighbors about the wild boar. Now hiring vocally gifted boys ages 7 to 9 for an exciting career in liturgical music. Competitive compensation, room and board provided. Unique career trajectory. Procedure required. Performed off-site. Ask no questions. Equal opportunity employer. And the cultural appetite for this? The opera audiences who packed the houses. The church congregations who wanted that particular sound in their cathedrals. The kings and queens who hired the standouts for private performance. Was, depending on how you want to look at it, either the engine of the whole machine or just the last link in a chain that was already moving. The argument historians have, and I'm not going to pretend to settle it, is whether the audience demand caused the supply or whether the supply caused the audience demand. Either way, for 300 years, the answer to should we keep doing this was apparently yes, the music is really good. The thing finally started to die in the late 18th century, partly because Napoleon invaded Italy and shut down a lot of the conservatories, partly because public taste was shifting away from the castrato voice in opera, and partly because, and I want to be precise here, there was a slow, uneven, century-long realization across European culture that maybe the practice was, on reflection, bad. By the early 1800s, opera composers were writing parts for women instead. By the mid-1800s, the only remaining institutional employer of castrati was the Catholic Church. By the 1880s, it was just the Sistine Chapel Choir holding on, employing the last few aging singers because that was how the music had always been performed, and changing it felt wrong. In 1903, Pope Leo XIII died and was succeeded by Pope Pius X, who issued a formal ruling banning the future hiring of castrati in the Vatican. 304 years after the practice had effectively started in the Sistine Chapel. The official ban came roughly 100 years after most of the rest of European society had stopped doing it, and roughly 50 years after it had become essentially impossible to find new castrati to hire anyway, because Italian families had finally, mostly, stopped agreeing to the contract. Great system, strong response time. The very last documented castrato in the Sistine Chapel was a man named Alessandro Moreschi. He was born in 1858. He was castrated as a child. The official record says it was due to an inguinal hernia, which, sure, fine. And he joined the Vatican choir in 1883. He served as the head soloist for years, and in 1902 and 1904, an early recording engineer brought a wax cylinder phonograph into the Vatican and recorded him singing. Those recordings still exist. You can find them on YouTube. They are, depending on who you ask, either the only surviving audio of a vocal tradition that defined 300 years of European music, or the haunted echo of a system that finally ran out of victims. Or both. They're both. They can be both. I'm not going to tell you whether to listen to them. That's between you and your search bar. And look, I do want to acknowledge, because I read way too much about this last weekend, instead of cancelling a streaming subscription I forgot I had until I got the renewal email at 11:47 p.m. and then immediately cancelled it before the new season I was specifically waiting for came out, which is a problem I'm not going to get into right now. There's a real argument among music historians that the castrato voice was musically extraordinary. That what was lost when the practice ended was a genuine artistic sound that nobody has been able to fully replicate since. That the boys who became Farinelli, the boys who became the legends, were participants in something that produced art people are still studying 3 centuries later. That argument exists. I'm telling you it exists because it's part of the historical record. I'm also telling you that for every Farinelli, there were thousands of kids who ended up in a cathedral choir in Bologna, singing the same Latin masses for 40 years, anonymous, uncompensated, beyond room and board. And then they died. And that was the deal. That was always the deal. The lottery was real, but the odds were the odds. 4,000 kids a year. 1% became stars. 99% didn't. The Vatican's last castrato, Moreschi, retired in 1913 and died in 1922. The recordings he left behind run about 40 minutes total. That's the entire surviving sound of the tradition. 40 minutes of audio for 300 years of practice, and somewhere between hundreds of thousands and over 1 million children processed through the pipeline. I keep doing the math on this, and the math keeps not working out. Anyway, I have to go reheat something I should have eaten 2 hours ago.